and David Sharp is with me today. David, hello. I'm Israel Hi.
Thank you, Anastasia. Good evening.
Our President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky said on the sidelines of the NATO summit that Ukraine needs 128 fighters to create effective competition in the sky. He also says that Russia is now using 300 aircraft against Ukraine. We had a decision about 10 to 20, but even if it is 50, it will not change anything. More is needed. Well, in parallel with this, information appears in the Bild publication, which writes that NATO surpasses Russia in the number of soldiers, aviation and navy, but is inferior in artillery. Why, then, if the West surpasses Russia in the number of aviation, then why is it given so little? Is there no political will?
The West surpasses Russia in aviation qualitatively and quantitatively very significantly. In general, if we talk about aviation, the West, if we talk about NATO, these are different leagues in general, I would even say different universes to a noticeable extent. I am not exaggerating here, I am not inclined to underestimate someone's capabilities. They do not give, there are several aspects here. Firstly, new aircraft. Not everyone is far inclined to give new aircraft for a variety of reasons. They need them here and now, and their shirt is closer to the body. New aircraft are expensive. Somewhere there is a consideration of secrecy, somewhere someone believes that the Ukrainians will not be able to use them effectively at all. If so, let's say, the efficiency from them will not be great. There are also opinions. I am not trying to say whether they are correct or not, they are usually not correct, but I am illustrating what approaches there are. And there are also objective circumstances. Objective circumstances are trained personnel. Aircraft are different. If you can learn very quickly on a tank, there is no question of single rifle weapons at all, even in a long time and close. Aircraft are piece goods even if we are talking about old machines, and the main thing is the training of personnel, and first of all the pilot. It takes a very long time to learn. Within the framework of these relatively short courses, we are now talking about 6 to 8 months that Ukrainians are trained can only be experienced pilots. If you train a pilot, a cadet from scratch, then these are years. I mean from the moment he entered the school and until the moment he can be fully thrown into battle, literally, years. So, there is an objective factor. This is a shortage of experienced pilots who can be retrained. Of course, I don't know the real numbers for the Ukrainians, but there were few pilots who were initially ready before the war, who were potentially capable of piloting F-16s or other aircraft, having been retrained in a fairly short time. I suppose that we are talking about, well, if only a few hundred at all, or maybe even less. Moreover, some of these pilots were killed, injured or out of action for objective reasons. Some of these pilots must be continuously at the front while their individual colleagues are training, in order to help defend the Ukrainian sky, in order to endure strikes on Russian targets. Some pilots must be there. You cannot send everyone and lose your own, even Soviet aviation. What am I driving at? That sending pilots, as I see it, can only be sent for training in small groups of a few dozen people, and that's still good. Only a few dozen were trained, the next group. And even if we assume that these cycles of months, 8 months, we can understand that there will be few planes for these people by definition. There is such a rule in the modern Air Force that there are significantly fewer planes than pilots. Otherwise, if they are, for example, the number is equal, then the planes will be idle. A pilot cannot fight 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Pilots, their work is very hard in all respects, physical, psychological and other. Pilots are needed more per plane, even taking into account the fact that the plane is under repair a lot. So imagine that if Ukraine has 30 aircraft, I just take this figure from the ceiling, you need at least 1.5 times more for this. There is no fixed figure here, there are approaches that twice as much, there are 1.4 times more trained pilots. It has not been possible to train so many pilots in Ukraine until now, in Ukraine and allies, including for objective reasons. Therefore, the number of aircraft must correspond to the number of pilots and, of course, ground personnel. But with ground staff, everything is not so simple either. But at least there is no need for a beginner or, especially, an experienced person to study for several years. That is, here the courses are shorter, although we are talking about serious specialists and specialties where specific experience with the F-16 is required. And here, I am sure, at first there will also be problems of an objective nature. These are new aircraft, new approaches. And even an experienced person who worked with the MiG-29, here he encounters completely new things. In general, I mean that it would be wrong to say that it would be possible to give 128 aircraft to Ukraine precisely in the context of the transfer of aircraft, namely in the context of how many pilots there are and how many personnel. 128, even with the fastest effective approach, receiving 128 aircraft so that they are at the disposal of the Ukrainian Air Force at a time, is a long process tied to training. In general, a lot of aircraft have already been promised. The figure is more than half of that number, but the problem is all about learning. If fundamental decisions on the supply of the F-16 had been made earlier, and here there can and should be claims to Western countries, then the process of education and training could have begun earlier, and today more aircraft would be in service and more pilots would be in the process of obtaining flight rights for the F-16.
Norway has clarified that it will transfer 6 F-16 fighters to Ukraine, but we also remember that Denmark is transferring 19. Belgium recently announced that their donation consists of 30 aircraft. While, in early July, the Netherlands allowed the export of 24 fighters to Ukraine. As I understand it, if they are transferred, then clearly not everyone will use them immediately.
Of course, they will be transferred only as soon as there are a slightly larger number of pilots than the number of aircraft. Moreover, there are rumors that they have already been given something, that they have been in Ukraine for more than one day, and rumors from fairly knowledgeable sources. However, no one should advertise the presence of aircraft. It is clear that this can harm the business. Another important point is their use at the first stage. How do I see it? There is indirect confirmation in the statements of official representatives of the Air Force. I would say that their use will be cautious and phased, that is, initially it is a cover of the Ukrainian sky in the western part of the country, in the central part of the country, a cover from cruise missiles and drones, and then, as the aircraft is mastered in a new operational situation, then they are slowly more daring and more active with the expansion of their functions. Therefore, expect that the arriving planes will immediately go on the attack on all fronts and will act very risky, as they say, on the verge of a foul. And according to the most dangerous and active protocols, as I see it, this will not happen. That would be wrong from an operational point of view. But here, of course, life will show. This is just my evaluative condemnation.
But you say that there are rumors that fighter jets are already in Ukraine, and there may be some rumors about their use.
Rumors about the use of patrols and attempts to work on cruise missiles and drones. But these are just rumors. Don't take me seriously. However, more seriously, there is probably something to it. Whether this is true or not, from what moment they are in Ukraine, I think we will find out. In fact, from what moment the first aircraft arrived in Ukraine and made a flight, we will find out, I think, a little later. I would not be very surprised if it turns out that they, say, have been flying in Ukraine for weeks. However, this may not be the case.
We understand that the F-16 will be given to us only with a clear understanding of fully covered airfields. And then, just at the NATO summit in Washington, Biden said that individual NATO countries would provide Ukraine with 5 new air defense systems. In addition, in the coming months, the United States and partners intend to provide Ukraine with dozens of tactical air defense systems, including NASAMS, IRIS-T, Gepard and others. Can we assume that the first aircraft will arrive with these systems? But if we talk about these air defense systems, then there seems to be nothing new. These are exactly the ones that we were promised.
Some of the systems, when they talk about those 5, may not have been transferred yet, but have already been repeatedly promised air defense systems, which can be considered a fait accompli. As for the other systems mentioned in the conversations that accompany them, there are systems that will be transferred, including long-range systems, including Patriot, from other sources in the near future, systems that are called tactical, including the latest NASAMS and IRIS-T systems in various modifications. These are also mainly systems. When we are talking about Germany and the United States, these are mainly systems that have already been promised, which were or are in production, that is, not from the assets of the US or German armed forces, but precisely in production, which were ordered at one time as part of this type of American assistance. After all, the Americans transfer part of the aid directly from the Pentagon's warehouses, and part is ordered from their own foreign manufacturers, and NASAMS is a vivid example of this. By the way, I do not think that anyone is conditioning the delivery of the F-16, which is already taking place, but at least the fact that we discussed with you, whether the first ones have already arrived or not, this is the second question. Right now, the delivery is taking place, and it is unlikely that it is directly linked to the fact that more air defense systems will be supplied. After all, the Ukrainians, of course, and Ukraine's partners really want the planes not to be damaged at the airfields. But I think Ukraine wants this most of all. Ukraine itself understands that ensuring their safety at airfields is a top priority. And this is due to a whole range of measures, ranging from specifically covering airfields with air defense systems and ending with the lack of routine at airfields, the construction of shelters, camouflage and many other measures. By and large, despite the problems that have emerged in the last, let's say, weeks and months, when the Russians managed to successfully strike Ukrainian airfields, Ukraine has been coping with these threats for more than 2 years, so I think there can be no such direct linkage, although recommendations to strengthen air defense, perhaps specific recommendations on how air defense will be given, and I would say the protection of the airfield as a whole. In general, the Ukrainians will receive a lot of air defense systems. A significant part has been promised, but some, I think, will be new, and this is from the new. I do not rule out that this kind of incentive for the transfer was the tragic events, namely the strike on Kyiv and specifically the hit on the children's hospital.
And if, David, we get one squadron of F-16s, a multi-ball air defense system, but we remember that Sweden promised us 2 radar aircraft, then how much can this change the course of the war?
I do not like to operate with the concepts of changing the course of the war. This can, yes, I like to say, add serious opportunities to Ukrainians. Of course, the early warning aircraft system, and quite modern ones, such as those promised by Sweden, is a very important step. I would say it is a more important theoretical step than the transfer of another F-16 to one squadron. Because this adds to the F-16s already transferred or being transferred, and not only to the F-16 but in general to the Ukrainian Air Force and air defense of Ukraine, it adds the most important capabilities. Simply, if you compare it with a person, you just see further and see better in any weather and at any time of the day. It's very, very simple and very, very difficult at the same time. Situational awareness. There is a problem with these planes. I see 2 problems. Firstly, the first and most important thing is that they have not yet been transferred, and it is not entirely clear when this will happen. I have heard estimates and explanations about the timing, and from the fact that some Swedish explanations from the Swedes themselves are coming out, and training on these aircraft, and a number of other aspects, apparently, they will not arrive very soon. I would like this to be a pleasant surprise, but, apparently, they will not arrive before 2025. Such are the assessments that sounded convincing. So, if they do, once again, this is the most important step towards turning the Ukrainian Air Force, or rather, the Air Force, into a real full-fledged Western-type mechanism. Because many people mistakenly think that the F-16 or even newer models of the F-16 or other aircraft arrived, and the Air Force automatically turns into something radically new. This is true, but it is not entirely true. The fact is that the Air Force is a whole range of capabilities, the tip of the spear in which to combat aircraft. However, a spear without a shaft is not a spear. And as a flagpole, it is necessary to remember that a lot is needed for a full-fledged mechanism when President Zelensky talks about 128 aircraft, so that these are full-fledged Western-type air forces. Starting from the experience of operational use gained by both ground and air personnel and ending with a variety of systems that are directly related to fighters, these are weapons, onboard and radar equipment, electronic warfare systems and other systems, in particular, long-range radar detection aircraft, tanker aircraft, reconnaissance aircraft. In general, a lot of important things. And only together, when this mechanism works synchronously, it turns into an effective force that can radically, I will not say, change the situation on the battlefield in some places, and in others, at least, have a very strong impact on it. And Ukraine is only at the beginning of the journey. And this path, it is important to be realistic, it takes years. Swedish aircraft would be a very important milestone on this path. It remains only to understand when they will arrive. And the second problem with them, the problem is not in the planes, it is the problem in ensuring their safety. And unlike the F-16, this will be even more difficult. These are large, rather clumsy aircraft that will be a priority target for both attempts to shoot them down and attempts to get them at airfields. And here, and they are already so one-off that they just have to be protected. To say like the apple of the eye is to say nothing. And this is the most serious challenge that the Ukrainian Armed Forces will have to face.
The Russian missile that destroyed the Okhmatdik Children's Hospital contained Western components, writes the Financial Times. And they say that 2 components were labeled as produced by a Swiss company, and the rest by American manufacturers. Western technology allows the Russians to make smarter missiles that allow them to pass by our air defenses. But the newspaper also writes that if in 2021 Russia produced Kh-101-56 missiles, then last year it already had 420 of them. And how does Russia manage to circumvent sanctions? It would seem that it has already been closed, but the number of weapons is growing, but, most likely, the quality is improving.
As for the quality, an interesting point. On the one hand, the missiles are apparently being improved, and we hear about this from Ukrainian sources. For example, they begin to shoot off interference to make it difficult to intercept them. They say that there is progress in altitudes, that is, they fly at lower altitudes than before. Perhaps the warhead is changing. In general, on the one hand, they are being improved, but on the other hand, there are questions about quality because missiles are made in a hurry and many components, including Western-made ones, in fact, do not meet the so-called military standard. That is, these are components that can be used. But, on the other hand, they are originally intended for the civilian market. In principle, for missiles and various kinds of weapons in general, it is customary, as a rule, to use such components and components that, let's say, differ from civilian ones. They must withstand heavy loads, must withstand more serious tests of various types. So, with this, of course, there are certain problems, as well as with mass production. In Russian ammunition the percentage of defects is quite high. By the way, just yesterday or the day before yesterday, somewhere in Kalmykia, it was found that Kalmykia is 300 kilometers from Ukraine, or rather, even more, what is 300 there, and in the opposite direction from Ukraine. A Kalib missile was found there, which was launched from somewhere, as apparently, it lost control, flew in the wrong direction. This is one of the examples and there are enough such examples. In general, as for the quantity, it must be understood that in 2021 Russia acted in peacetime, but in wartime mode, the available opportunities were maximized, including the very same smuggling under grey schemes through the third and through the second countries, from where the components are actually obtained. I will assume that those manufacturers who were named during the dismantling of the missile, that their overwhelming majority, if not all Western manufacturers, they were not aware until a certain point that their components, their production were used in this way. And even more so, they had nothing to do with the sales of these components to Russia. I'm not trying to shield anyone, I'm reasoning logically. None of them them would have done it deliberately. However, since these components are sold on the civilian market, including countries such as China, especially Turkey, the Emirates, and so on, and possibly the former countries of the former USSR are separate, for example, Asian countries, it is not surprising that in this way they get to Russia in a roundabout way. And if Western countries do not try to influence these countries through which they come very harshly, the flow of this smuggling will continue. It is important to understand that due to the fact that these components have to be bought in such a roundabout way, overpaid and delivered through second and third countries, Russia pays more, and Russia apparently receives fewer components than it would do in peacetime directly. That is, Russian production is actually suffering. That is, if there were no sanctions, I see it, the missiles would be cheaper for them, and they would be able to receive more components. However, what is available is enough to produce several dozen of these expensive missiles per month at the most conservative estimates, an estimate of 400-something per year. I am not sure that this is an exact figure, a real one, which is directly known, but it is an estimate that sounds realistic on the basis of some indirect signs. On the one hand, this does not seem to be very much, but on the other hand, it is a lot. This suggests that every month Ukraine can be shelled by these several dozen missiles without decreasing in number for the arsenals of the Russian army. And a few dozen missiles a month are, let's say, several fairly significant strikes. That is, in fact, it is possible to carry out strikes on a weekly basis, only relying on the number of Kh-101s that are being produced. But there are other missiles, there are also drones. There are stocks of missiles. In general, this is the most important component in everything related to strikes on the Ukrainian rear. Yes, and without Western components, the situation would be worse. Unfortunately, I do not see a solution that would lead to a significant deterioration of the situation for Russia in this regard within the framework of the current policy of Western countries.
By the way, the Financial Times writes that Russia buys components on the open market and imports them through China. And about China, in the text of the final declaration of the NATO summit, China will be called an accomplice of Russia, Reuters reports. According to the source, the document will call China the decisive accomplice of the Russian Federation in the war against Ukraine and call for an end to any material and political support for the Kremlin's war effort. Can such actions really have an impact?
As I see it, on the one hand, they are trying to put pressure on China to act with carrots and sticks, a little bit of sanctions against China, warnings and pressure, but on the other hand, they do not want to cross certain borders with China, and they do not want to for various reasons. Secondly, they are afraid that China will take some drastic retaliatory step, and secondly, they understand, and this should always be remembered, this is always present in the background, that serious sanctions against China can affect the economies of the countries that impose these sanctions, because China also has many tools. In general, a lot depends on China in everything related to production. So, in any democratic country, what does a politician think about in the first place? That's right, about how to be elected and how not to lose, firstly, purely out of personal interests, and secondly, out of the interests of implementing one's own political agenda, as they say. He says, let's say, in everything related to providing assistance to Ukraine, we will put pressure on China, it will become easier for Ukraine, but I will lose the elections, someone will come, thanks to whom Ukraine will feel worse. Here is such a primitive reasoning for you, but first of all, of course, they care about keeping their own places. And not to lose the elections, because the deterioration of the economic situation in any country is the most important factor that affects the voters' decision. The most legendary and symbolic product in this regard is gasoline and oil. For the United States, I don't know, this is a kind of symbol and the very case when any American leadership, no matter whether current or otherwise, is very, very afraid, especially in the pre-election period, that oil prices will rise and gasoline will become more expensive, and this will influence the decision of the voters. In general, with China, this kind of declaration, apparently, here is how not to recall another anecdotal term, another Chinese warning. If all this is really voiced, what you have just mentioned, it will be another warning from China. However, the Chinese leader is not timid. He acts according to his own chosen strategy, and his strategy, on the one hand, makes Russia dependent on China, and on the other hand, so that the West curries favor with China. And this, in general, is what we see, by and large. It has a margin of safety and proceeds from his own interests. As I see it, it is not words that can change the position, but real threats to Chinese companies and China, both public and private. For example, those who trade with Russia in this kind of dual-use goods and are engaged in smuggling, sanctions against them, especially if we are talking about serious companies that do business both in the United States and in Western Europe, would be a very serious blow to them. But for this it is necessary to be decisive, to separate the main from the secondary, to be consistent. At some stage, threats, empty threats, not only cease to matter, but on the contrary, they expose the one who threatens in vain, let's say, in an unpleasant light, as an idiot. And here it is very important to remember this, and it is important to implement certain threats in practice. Otherwise, it can only get worse.
Reuters writes that a delegation of elite military personnel from the DPRK was brought to the so-called Russia. This is the first military exchange between the two countries since their leaders signed agreements on military cooperation. Are these the engineering troops that were previously written about, or are they those whom the Russian Federation can let to the front in Ukraine, as infantry?
It's hard to say, but, first of all, when they talk about someone elite, these are clearly not the construction battalion troops that were mentioned. And what was said, I recall, in general, from the words of the South Korean media about some engineers, but of the most primitive type, those who are supposed to carry out construction, some rear work, although such work should not be underestimated. So, here, if we are talking about the arrival of some elite forces, this is not at all the personnel who are engaged in construction in the rear. You can assume anything here. Perhaps this is just some kind of exchange of experience, or rather, the Koreans want to learn some Russian experience. After all, Russia is a warring country. It is unlikely that Russia is interested in Korean experience in any areas, although, who knows, maybe they are, or maybe this is preparation for the arrival of some Korean military, in fact, in order to fight. Moreover, we must understand that the information was about these construction battalions or engineering troops, but it would be wrong to believe that this information was exhaustive. We absolutely do not know what Kim and Putin agreed on. Theoretically, they could agree on some more active participation of at least a small, I emphasize, most likely a large contingent, but for example, a small contingent of the Korean Armed Forces, their quite active participation in hostilities. Could they have agreed? Could. I don't know if this is true, so here we need to wait for real results, leaks from the Pentagon, leaks from the Korean Special Services, which are carefully monitoring the situation, and in general, as they say, you can't hide an all in a bag. It will also be difficult to hide Koreans on the Russian-Ukrainian front if they appear there. Let's see what that means.
David, thank you very much for the interesting conversation, for your analytics and for finding time for the broadcast. I wish you a good day and remind you that David Sharp, a military observer, was in touch with us.
Mr. Roman, we have several provocations from the Kremlin, from Russian propaganda in the media space. Let's start with the most interesting ones. About the fact that the press drunk Zakharova, you don't need to pay attention to her, but she made such a statement that we cannot ignore. And here, Mr. Roman, I want to ask you for an explanation. She said Kyiv is preparing the destruction of the rowing of the Kyiv Hydroelectric Power Plant and the Kyiv water shelter. This will be another cynical provocation against Russia. This was promised by the representative of the Russian Foreign Ministry Zakharova. How should such statements be received in the media? We remember, unfortunately, the experience of the Kharkovka HPP and other Russian provocations. Do the Russians now have the opportunity to blow up the Kyiv Hydroelectric Power Plant? And in general, is this a possible distraction from the situation with Okhmadit?
If the explosion of the Kyiv reservoir had covered Moscow with water and flooded it for several days, then, in principle, one could have thought about it. And why do we need to heat Kyiv? That is, the Russians, as always, have no logic. To hang something on Moscow, and what else is not weighed there? Everything that is possible is already hanging there, from hundreds of thousands of dead Ukrainians to the explosion of the same Kyiv Hydroelectric Power Plant, so you can't hang anything new there, we simply don't need it. But the Russian media are now mostly throwing out any messages that can put pressure on our military and political leadership, on our armed forces of Ukraine, on our Ukrainian people in order to intimidate and force capitulation. They have already set the terms of surrender. Putin has repeatedly said that this is the withdrawal of the Ukrainian armed forces from the Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, Kherson and Crimean regions and not joining NATO. Plus restrictions on the army and so on and so forth. Step by step Putin is trying to seize all of Ukraine. Naturally, there is pressure in the information flow, and some half-sober Russian comrades are trying to somehow splash it out on us, including in our media. We understand all this very well, therefore, from this point of view, of course, we do not perceive it. But from the point of view of technical mechanisms, for example, the Russians blowing up some of our hydroelectric power plants or dams, or, let's say, diverting water along the Dnieper. In this sense, the Russians are masters, in principle, that is, they blew up the Kyiv Hydroelectric Power Plant, but only when they were there. It's the Russians who undermine themselves, as always. And since they are nowhere else, not in any of our reservoirs or in some hydroelectric power plants or dams, they can only do this with the help of long-range weapons. These are either missiles or aviation. It is very difficult to destroy some dam with missiles. Missiles can damage, for example, a hydroelectric power plant. Yes, it is possible. There are no questions, but it is almost impossible to destroy the dam with missiles. The dam can be destroyed by the approach of bombers, for example, with the dropping of free-fall bombs and in sufficient quantities. More than a dozen aerial bombs must be dropped directly at almost one point of the dam in order to damage it. The Russians do not have such an option at the moment. Therefore, let's perceive this action of the Russian information war, information propaganda, as such pressure. That is, we have been under pressure for more than a year. For the 11th year they have been putting pressure on us, and we are standing, we are also snapping at the edge.
To the next, probably, informational provocations. The Belarusian law enforcement agencies, in order to demonstrate their strength to China, may be preparing a provocation under a false flag in the border zone with Ukraine. I report this with a message to the Center of National Resistance. Mr. Roman, how possible is such a scenario, perhaps even with the participation of Chinese troops?
Probably, we will distinguish Belarusians from Chinese. It is there that it is impossible to distinguish Russians from Buryats. They are almost all Buryats and Yakuts. But we will definitely get rid of the Belarusians from the Chinese. And I think there will be a very big surprise for Xi Jinping when he receives packages, and directly, probably, by new mail from Ukraine, with the Chinese remnants of Chinese troops, and we can organize this for him. That is, it would be very interesting to see exactly this development of the situation. And the fact that the Belarusians will prepare some provocations, yes, they definitely can, only not to show the Chinese, but in order to provoke, perhaps, some clashes for the sake of action. It is not yet clear what they are. Why? Because there is a little bit of logic from the point of view of the technical execution of this kind of actions. Why? Because we will immediately start working on the Belarusian refineries. Right away, just in. The Messiah refinery will be gone in a second. It is located there a few tens of kilometers from our border. Can you imagine what our main intelligence directorate or security service will do to the Messiah oil refinery if they are told we will finally allow them to work? As for the main refinery, by the way, which supplies the same Auburn, the most interesting thing is that from the Messiah refinery, the friendship pipe splits, so to speak, moving towards Europe, Poland and Hungary, and through Ukraine. Part goes to Hungary, through Ukraine. There is also a product pipeline, that is, Belarusian diesel, which is pumped to Auburn. It is pumped just through Ukraine. Therefore, the destruction of the Messiah refinery is the first task, and a very easy task for our long-range weapons, which will immediately be used by our special services. The second, Naftan, is not far from the Messiah refinery, and if these two plants burn down, then it will take a long time, for example, for Lukashenko to justify himself to Xi Jinping. In general, why did he stir up this topic? Why? Because the main flow of Chinese goods goes through Belarus. This is the Silk Road now, which was set up by China through Belarus. Otherwise, if Belarus catches fire, China simply has no more mechanisms than to supply Europe with its cheap fakes, from which they receive more than $500 billion a year. That is, by and large, I don't think so. Lukashenko can, I repeat again, technically it is possible, there are no problems here. But what Lukashenko will receive in the future, to put it mildly, is a big scolding from Xi Jinping, and this will cost him an iron crown and a chair. Maybe, of course, if he is nailed to this chair, he will keep himself, but he will definitely lose the crown, so I do not think that Lukashenko will still really take this kind of action, although he can threaten with this.
Mr. Roman, to the following announcements, which appear mainly from the Russian Telegram channel, the Chaker of the GPU, with reference to several sources, claim that the commander of the airborne troops of the Russian Federation, the DNPR group of troops, Colonel General Mikhail Teplinsky, has recently behaved somehow inadequately. The inadequacy in the general's behavior towards the subjects began to manifest itself after the last wound, which he received as a result of a blow to the command post of the DNPR group of troops directly at the end of June, and Teplinsky simply ceased to be recognized. What fate can await this character, since it is obvious that there are some denunciations, there are negative comments on him, and what can happen next?
Any injury, especially if it is some kind of barotrauma or contusion, it naturally gives it serious consequences, pressure on the psyche definitely. And those who fight and ask for the death of their soldiers or kill, especially civilians, definitely have mental problems. This problem is poured out by the Russians. They basically work this way. They pour alcohol, and the heavy impact of alcohol leads to certain psychoneurological disorders. But these are questions, of course, for doctors. He will perform his function until he is recognized, say, as some kind of insane. Why? Because half of the Russian generals there can be recognized as insane even without a medical diagnosis and without examination by doctors. This insanity is written on their faces, so I don't think that they will quickly push him somewhere or remove him for us. By the way, this will not be a very good move. For us, the more such deranged generals run the Russian army, the better. If they are sick all over the head, then they are the ones who lay down their soldiers more than create problems for our troops. And we, of course, are hunting for him, because he is one of the main, so to speak, one of the main Russian generals who are involved in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who died during this war in 10 years.
Mr. Roman, also the Telegram channel Strana Ukraine writes that the Russians decided to equip the sides of two 95 MS strategic bombers at the Olenia Air Base in the Murmansk region. And because of this, monitoring channels and monitoring will no longer be able to track the number of missile-equipped boards. It turns out that in this way, every sortie of a bomber in Russia will now be perceived as a combat flight, or not. Or how to interpret this information at all.
We perceive any flight of the Tu-95X as combat, as it can be potentially dangerous. Therefore, the transmission of information will definitely go on, but there may be more such unconfirmed air raids. As, for example, with the MiG-31K. When the MiG-31K takes off, it is not clear whether it is with a missile or not, there is still an air raid. Therefore, I think the Tu-95 will be the same. Sometimes some Tu-95 takeoffs they will be without confirmation, but the MiG-31 will take off more often without missiles than the Tu-95. The takeoff of the Tu-95 is, first of all, a rather dangerous event. They are already falling apart in the air, so they drop 2 missiles and not 8, although they can drop 8. They don't even raise 8 missiles now. The wing folds, the half wings fall off. That is, I do not think that the Tu-95 will often fly, for example, without missiles. And on the other hand, if the takeoff of the Tu-95 turns out to be a false alarm, we, on the contrary, will perceive it with such a positive, at least moment.
American President Biden, during the presentation of Volodymyr Zelensky at the summit in Washington, mistakenly called him President Putin. I'll quote what Biden said. Now I want to give the floor to the President of Ukraine, who is as brave as he is decisive. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. We are all human, we all make mistakes, from time to time. Don't you think that Biden's slip of the tongue was very untimely, since right now all Democrats are analyzing his status and ability to continue the pre-election campaign?
Yes, there is this problem. I'm in my 70s and I'm talking too. I can't blame a person who is already in his 9th decade. These are technical problems. Nothing can be done about it. Old age is not a joy. This must be understood. And if we are to condemn, so to speak, then it is not Biden himself who is to be condemned. He is just a man who has already lived a fairly long life, and I understand him in an old man's way. And it is necessary to condemn those who push him to fulfill this task. Behind him are people who push him to the next presidency. That is, they practically set up a person who could already rest and spend his old age with his family, with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, if he has any. That is, by and large, this is precisely the problem of these people. That is, the clique that stands behind Biden and which has not prepared a replacement for him. He has no replacement. Why is he being pushed to do this? There is no replacement for him. They did not prepare, did not sniff and scratch themselves even in order not to pull this old man, respected at the expense of old age, to perform these tasks. But I think that it is precisely such blunders that the old man makes. I repeat, in no case can he be blamed for this. That will lead to the fact that they will put pressure on this clique behind Biden, and this is the Obama clique. We have repeatedly said this, that is, they will put pressure on this Obama clique. They will still squeeze out some contender, and there is an even better optimal option. The Democratic Party should forget about this Biden-Obama clique that led to the unleashing of the war in Ukraine. They have unequivocally sold Crimea and Donbass to the Russians since 2014. They have not lifted a finger in order to fulfill their promises under the Budapest Memorandum. That is, to push them somewhere, forget for them and nominate a new candidate. There are a sufficient number of candidates. Let him not be promoted, let it be through Trump, after one term of Trump. But nevertheless, prepare the candidate and move on. American politics will not go anywhere. These two parties have been leading America for several hundred years, replacing each other, so this is probably the right development of events. If it happens, it will only be possible to support it.
Now, Mr. Roman, returning to the situation at the front and on the territory of Russia. Russian ships mine the harbor near the port in Novorossiysk. Probably, the occupiers are afraid of our strikes by Ukrainian drones. This was reported by the Telegram channel of the ATESH protest movement. In principle, we often remember Novorossiysk in our affairs. What do you think the occupiers, the Russians, are afraid of? And should we expect drone attacks in the direction of Novorossiysk?
I know what our generals, Malyuk and Budanov, are afraid of now. They will be afraid of a grain deal that will tie their hands and feet, mouths, close his eyes and generally throw him somewhere on the shelf. And why? Because when will the grain deal go, which for some reason has now been launched? That is, it was launched after all these summits, and this grain deal will stop all military operations in the Black Sea. Therefore, these two generals are definitely afraid that after the launch of the grain deal, they will be banned from performing a combat mission, and they may be in a hurry to strike at the Novorossiysk port now before the grain deal, and even more so they must eventually account for the 300 million that were collected on Sea Baby.
Удары по Новороссийскому порту, а тем более надо же в конце концов отчитаться за те 300 миллионов, которые были собраны на Sea Baby.
If you remember, there was such a serious groundwork they collected from the world by a thread. The SBU officers walked with a hat, collected money for Sea Baby, which was supposed to work on the Kerch Bridge and on the Novorossiysk port. And the Kerch Bridge stood and stands, and the Novorossiysk port stood and works. Well, that is, it stood in the sense of eating and working. And here a question will arise for these two generals. Generals, you have to answer for your words somehow. Of course, each other has shoulder straps, no one will force you, but there is such a problem. Our generals may understand that this problem from politicians can be like this, it's just a setup. Why? Because if a grain deal begins, then any hostilities in the context of, at least this grain deal, will be perceived as terrorism. And these two generals can rattle in the International Criminal Court. And so, most likely, now there can be an understanding, all these processes, some kind of preparation is accelerating, and we, perhaps, in the end will see the use of these 300 million in the Novorossiysk port, and the Russians are trying to somehow cover it. Again, hoping for a grain deal, for the fact that Erdogan and our politicians from the executive branch, who are long overdue to be replaced, they will have time, so to speak, to cover the Novorossiysk port and the Kerch Bridge with these terms of this grain deal from our Ukrainian generals, from the impact of our armed forces of Ukraine.
Мост этими условиями этой зерновой сделки от наших украинских генералов, от воздействия наших вооруженных сил Украины.
Mr. Roman, and further about the F-16. I understand, perhaps, and you are already tired of talking about it, and all Ukrainians are tired of waiting for these planes on the territory of our Ukraine. Bloomberg, citing its own sources, writes that Ukraine expects to send 6 F-16 aircraft from Western partners this summer and a total of up to 20 aircraft by the end of the year. And, according to people familiar with the matter, the process of sending military aircraft to Ukraine is now complicated by the issue of spare parts and the language barrier between Ukrainian pilots and their foreign instructors. Do you think it could be that the main two problems are spare parts and such a language barrier?
No, the main problem is being in the White House, in the leadership of the Biden administration. This is the main problem. And the main break is there, in the White House. They did everything possible to ensure that the Ukrainian Air Force did not receive a single aircraft. They did not hand over their F-16s or, at least, stop this movement, did not give us the opportunity to transfer other aircraft, neither Mirages, nor Rafales, nor Gripens, did not give us the opportunity to buy the same South Korean T-50s around the world. That is, this is a problem, these breaks are just in the White House. And everything else is not a cause, it is, so to speak, a consequence of the cause that I have just said. Until the Biden administration leaves, until it is squeezed out either by the Democrats themselves or by the Republicans, by voting and the American people, by voting for Trump, we will not see enough planes. Indeed, we can see one pair there, a flight, 1.5 flights, maybe a squadron, 2 squadrons, but I repeat once again, until the Biden administration leaves the helm in the White House, we will not see a sufficient number of aircraft. We will not see any planes. Why? Because the aviation component, if we only have enough of it, that is, also with equipment, is very important, because the aircraft itself is just a platform with a sufficient number of weapons. It will produce such a game-changer mode on one of the sectors of the front, that's for sure.
Она произведет такой режим геймченджера на одном из участков фронта, так это точно.
Even if not on the entire front, but on the southern, maybe on Zaporozhye, then it will definitely be a game changer that will allow our troops to simply overturn the Russian defenses to start moving towards Crimea. This, by the way, is exactly what Biden is afraid of, because all this is not in the calculated mode of relations with Moscow. And until these guys with Moscow contractors leave the process management scene, I don't think we will see enough planes. Of course, we will hope, even when the first pair appears. Well, we will probably rejoice, although, to be honest, such joy will be too long awaited. We have already said many times that it was already possible to walk around the balloon 3 times in the time that we have fed stories about the transfer of the F-16.
Mr. Roman, as always, we thank you for this meaningful conversation. Thank you for your clear answers and for your forecasts. Let me remind you that Roman Svitan is a design pilot, a colonel in the reserve of the Ukrainian army.